So, in the first week of the new series about the nature of God, Dr. Willis talked quite a bit about the things that God is and the things that God is not. Um, he made reference to the passage that I want to focus on for this week in Exodus chapter 34. If you have your Bibles, you want to be starting to turn there. Well, I give a little background thinking about what's been going on in Exodus up to this point. God's people have been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. In Bible counting, that's 10 generations. All these people know is slavery. All these people know is being oppressed by Egypt. All these people know is a long time ago God made promises to their ancestors, but it seems like he's been pretty slow in fulfilling those promises. And then God shows up and uses Moses to bring the people out of Egypt, to perform miracles, to provide the deliverance that Israel needs. There's been a lot of action in the first chapters of the book of Exodus. And yet, once God's people come through the Red Sea and they arrive at Mount Sinai and they receive the law from the Lord, things kind of slow down a little bit. You might notice in some of those chapters, starting in Exodus 20 and moving into those next chapters, that there's a lot of talking and not very much action. So God's people are getting a little restless, right? Moses is up on the mountain. He's disappeared into the cloud to talk with God, to receive the law for the people. And the people are left in their tents, waiting, eating manna over and over again. And so they decide something's probably happened, and they need to move on. They need to do something. Maybe some of us during this time of quarantine can relate to the desire to do something. And so you know what happens, right? They go to Aaron, and Aaron is kind of at a loss. And so he takes their gold and he turns it into an idol. He turns it into a calf, a golden calf. We're really quick to condemn their idolatry. But maybe we could spend a little bit of time thinking about why they might do something like this. They've been in Egypt for generations. All they know are the gods of Egypt's pantheon. And they want to know what this new God, this God who is speaking to Moses, this God who has delivered them, this God who has given them 10 commandments and very little else. They want to know what this God is like, right? They want to know God's nature, sort of like what we're studying right now. And so they decide that God's nature is closest to the Egyptian God, who is depicted in the Egyptian pantheon as a bull, as a calf, a bull calf. The god is called Hapi. He represents the king. He's a symbol of strength, a symbol of fertility. And so as Israel is looking back on their recent history with this God, the God of their ancestors that they don't remember very well, this God who is working on their behalf, this God that they wish would hurry up and do something else, they decide that the best representation they can come up with to depict God's nature is this God of the king, this God of fertility, this God of strength, because that's the God they need, right? They're out in the desert, running away from their taskmasters and not quite sure what they're running toward. And so they need a king. So they make God after their own image. Let's not be too hard on them. We do that too, don't we? We're stuck in a particular situation and it seems like God isn't moving as fast as we would like him to. And so we decide to turn to whatever seems like the God that we need or the God that we want. And so we make God in our own image as well. Now, you know the rest of the story, how it plays out. Moses comes down from the mountain and he's very angry, smashes the tablets with the 10 Commandments and grinds them up and makes the people drink them. There's a huge plague and many, many people die. And the people are a little worried about this God. And they come to Moses and say, help us, intercede for us. And so Moses does. Chapter 33 is a wonderful depiction of how Moses was willing to come before God and intercede on behalf of the people. And one of the things that Moses reminds God is, remember, these are your people. Don't forget, you helped them, you delivered them, you chose them. And God agrees to stick with it. God agrees to start over again. And so as we get into chapter 34, Moses is going back up the mountain. God tells him, Exodus 34, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself there to me on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or to be seen anywhere on the mountain. Not even the flocks and herds may graze in front of the mountain. Sounds a little familiar. Sounds like what happened back in chapters 18 and 19 when Moses met with God on Mount Sinai. This is very much a picture of starting over. Verse 4. So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up Mount Sinai early in the morning as the Lord had commanded him. And he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Verse 5. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshipped. O Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, he said, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. The Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. The nature of God is a God who declares himself. He's not interested in the people choosing the kind of God that they think he is, or pretending that they know all of the things that make up who God is. God himself is the one who proclaims his full name and his full nature. And he reveals it here to Moses, I think, for really important reasons. The people have messed up. The people have not even been that long outside of Egypt, and they've already forgotten everything that God did for them. The people have said that they will be part of the covenant. They have said that they'll agree, that they'll obey the Lord, that he'll be their God and they'll be his people. And yet it only took a few short weeks of waiting at the base of Mount Sinai for them to fall away. That sounds a lot like us, doesn't it? So God proclaims his name and describes himself with these different characteristics that we see in verse 6 and 7. Compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. The particular focus for our lesson this week is on the very last part, abounding in faithfulness, which is what my translation says. The Hebrew term that's used here is chesed. Now, like a lot of Hebrew terms, it's one small word, and yet it has a whole range of meaning. It's actually kind of hard to translate accurately into English. Some English translations will say steadfast love. Some translations will translate it loving kindness or unfailing love. Some will use the word faithfulness or covenant loyalty. Chesed incorporates all of those concepts, all of those ideas together to think about who God is and how God acts with his people. Even language struggles to describe who God is. We're the ones who are limited. God is not. So this primarily is a covenant term. It's a term that really does relate to what's going on with Moses and the people in front of Mount Sinai. God's making the covenant with them, that which is so much more than just the Ten Commandments, but it's definitely represented by those tablets. God is going to uphold his end of the covenant, even when Israel fails, even when we fail. God is chesed. God is steadfast love. God is covenant loyalty. He's never going to give up on us. And that's definitely good news for us as well as for Israel. So as we think about some of the ways that steadfast love shows up in the Bible, we see this term chesed reinterpreted or repeated in some other biblical texts. In the Old Testament, the book of Ruth is a study in this sense of covenant loyalty or steadfast love, right? Ruth shows steadfast love to her mother-in-law Naomi after her husband dies, after she's lost everything, to return with her to Bethlehem, to go back to a strange people and to participate in a strange religion to her. And yet Ruth says, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And that's a good human example of what it means to practice this steadfast love that God shows first to us. Later in that same book, Boaz shows steadfast love to the family of Elimelech, to both Ruth and Naomi, by redeeming them, by functioning as the kinsman redeemer in their situation, by marrying Ruth and providing a child to carry on the family name. That ultimately results in King David, who is also one who is described as the one after God's heart, God's steadfast love heart. Another example in the Old Testament is Hosea, the prophet, who is commanded by God to marry an unfaithful wife and to struggle through that relationship as a physical example, a tangible demonstration of the sort of love that God shows to Israel, who is also just as unfaithful, probably more so. In the New Testament, there are some examples, again, of steadfast love. The Hebrew term turns into Greek, which we would probably translate most closely as faithfulness. Joseph demonstrates this faithfulness to a pregnant Mary, when he could just as easily have divorced her. Paul demonstrates steadfast love when he provides correction and teaching and encouragement to all these churches who are struggling to follow God faithfully, just as Israel struggled to follow God faithfully. The disciples, for all of their faults and all of their failings, are also able to demonstrate this kind of faithfulness to Jesus when others are turning away from him. And Jesus says, "Are you going to leave too?" And the disciples reply, "Where would we go?" They are willing to stick things out when times get tough, and they provide an example for us. Obviously, the best example in the New Testament of God's steadfast love, of the chesed of God, is of course found in the person of his Son, who was faithful to the point of death, even as Paul says, death on the cross. Human beings, of course, are always going to fall short. God is the only one who is able to be completely steadfast in his love for us and his commitment to us. But we learn from God's example and are able to show steadfast love in our relationships, just as Hosea did, as an example to the world of what it means to uphold your commitments, to maintain faithfulness, to be loyal, even in an age where those kind of values are not necessarily the ones that are cheered in social media today. God is the one who never gives up on us. May he give us the grace to never give up as well.